We're taught today by the Darwinians, or those who espouse the Darwinian theory, that life evolved from an initial pool of water with molecules in it that were basically inorganic, and that some way, sometime, somehow, those inorganic molecules were swept together into a living entity, something that was somehow alive. Now, we know that's not true now, and it's beginning to shift. The teaching is still the same because it takes a while to change the books, but it's becoming acknowledged that life almost had to be delivered to Earth. And the facts are incontrovertible that that's going to be the truth. When life first appears at around 4 billion years ago, the solar system itself is only about 500 million years old, only about 500 million years old. Not really enough time for anything to develop because the Earth was still basically a seething ball of magma then. Very little land had actually cooled out, very little water would be available for anything to form in. The Darwin's warm pool, warm pond, couldn't possibly have existed when life first came. Not only did life come suddenly at a time when it's just inexplicable that that would happen, it came in not one form but in two forms. Prokaryotic bacteria, there are two kinds. For a long time it was thought that there was just one kind, but there are actually two. So you have suddenly, at around 4 billion years ago, two distinct separate kinds of prokaryotic bacteria appear on Earth as the first life forms. And those life forms were so complex and so complicated, even though they didn't have the nucleus of the eukaryotic bacteria, which came later, much later. Even though they didn't have cell nucleus, they're functioning to this day, because we have them to this day. Their functioning is so complex, so chemically complex, there's no doubt that it couldn't possibly have developed here. It had to have been delivered here, and it had to be delivered whole and intact, and it had to come at about 4 billion years ago. So, given those facts right out of the box, there is no Darwinian development at the first stage of life as we understand it. Then as you move along through the history, Darwin postulated that from that beginning, however that beginning occurred, and he was no more clear on it than we were until just recently, however that beginning occurred, it had to develop very slowly but very regularly toward more and more complex beings, more creatures, however you care to term that. And as that slow, gradual progression developed, ever more sophistication was put into the system by what he called natural selection, which is little traits that would somehow help a creature improve its odds of reproducing itself, would make for more and more and more sophisticated beings and creatures. And that's how we supposedly evolved, a word Darwin didn't use but which became popular later. We evolved from those bacteria through millions and millions and millions of slight improvements to creatures that were intermediate, the intermediate forms. Now, when Darwin put forth his theory in 1869, he said very clearly, if the intermediate forms that I'm postulating cannot be found, then my theory is wrong. He knew that there was a problem because even in his day it was clear in the fossil record that there were these huge gaps and then things would just suddenly appear. So he said, now that we know to look for them, we should find these intermediate species. We haven't found any really to this point. We do find development within species. We do find changes at the micro level, which is changes in parts. Darwin himself found the changes in the beaks of the finches, Darwin's finches, the shells of the tortoises that he found on the Galapagos. So he found indications of change at the micro level, at the part level. And what he postulated, what he extrapolated is, well, if we can see obvious change at the micro level, then we can legitimately assume that change also is going to occur at the macro level, at the whole body level, so that it will be possible for one species to change into, over time, another species entirely. And that was the bedrock of his theory. And again, he said, but if you can't find any transitional species where it's clear that one thing is turning into something else, or that thing is turning into something else yet again, there will be a problem. And that's been the result of much more detailed analysis of the fossil record. There are no intermediate species. Now, once scientists began to understand that and realize that what you saw was long periods of life existing in what is called stasis, which means the same. It basically stays the same. In the fossil record, you have these long periods of stasis followed by these periods of catastrophe where everything is just gone. It's wiped out. Not everything, but most everything. And then you have these periods of not much happening, and then suddenly the niches get filled up again very rapidly, these explosions of life forms. So when science in the 50s and 60s began to see what the reality of the situation was and how far it was from classic Darwinism, which they were already very heavily bought into because that's what they used to maintain the moral high ground against the creationists, they knew they had a problem. So Stephen Gould and some others came up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium. And what punctuated equilibrium says is that as life develops, there are catastrophes that wipe them out. It's pretty clear from the fossil record that these happen. There's been 5 major ones and several minor ones. In the major ones, you had wipeouts of life forms anywhere from 50% to 80%, 90% of all life forms wiped out. The first big one, the Permian, wiped out about 90% of the life forms that existed at that time. And yet, after this happens, the ecological niches are filled with new species that are suited to the new environment, whatever it is. So you have the catastrophe that changes everything, changes the atmosphere and changes the earth. Some things survive because they are adapted or are able to adapt themselves to the new environment. But then new species come in that are adapted to whatever that new environment is each time. Now, how does that happen? How can that happen? How can they rapidly fill in within a few thousand years all of the niches? Can evolution do that? No. There's no record. You would have to see it. The example that I give when I talk is this, that you take a kernel of popcorn. Now, under normal circumstances, under the Darwinian scheme of things, if you were to heat that popcorn kernel, it would puff itself into one piece of popcorn. And that's the Darwinian theory of one thing moving into the next stage up its ladder as it goes. But during punctuated equilibrium, what they're postulating is that the one kernel of popcorn is somehow going to pop itself into a whole big bucket that you get at the movie. That really is not possible, and yet that's what they're saying. They're saying that the few survivors somehow explode biologically and genetically into all these different species that fill the ecological niches. That really, it can't happen under the Darwinian scenario. So what you have the punctuated equilibrium people saying is that Darwinism works when it can work, but when it can't work, something else works, which is so how do you turn a force of nature on and off like a switch? Can't really happen. What I think and what I say is probably Earth is being terraformed. Earth is being watched over. And when they see that a catastrophe has happened, they wait, they give it time to settle out, they give the new environment time to establish itself. They come in, they take some tests, and they say, okay, these things can live here now, and these things are dumped off here to live and make their way until the next catastrophe. that explains the facts to me, for as silly as it sounds. Terraformers, cosmic dump trucks is another term that I use. For as silly as that sounds, it seems to match the facts of what the fossil record tells us better than Darwinism by a long shot. But obviously, because it's so far from Darwinism and the establishment is so heavily bought into Darwinism, it isn't going to be readily accepted. But I think over time, something like that is going to be the real true answer of what's going on here.
Thank you. So, as far as humans are concerned, you went over micro and macroevolution. We're told that we evolved from primates.
Right.
So, how does that play in? I mean, what does that bear out? I mean,
we are told, as far as human beings go, we are told that we evolved in the Darwinian sense from primates, that we are related genetically and biologically and very closely to chimpanzees and somewhat more distantly to gorillas and orangutans and gibbons. So, but chimpanzees are our closest genetic and biological relatives. So we are primates. We are all considered primates, all of us in the primate family, the chimps and the gorillas and us. The problem is we really don't share any of the basic fundamental primate traits. Starting with our bones. Our bones are much lighter and less dense than are all the other primate bones. Our muscles are much weaker than any other primate's muscles, 5 to 10 times as weak. So where our bones are less dense, our muscles are substantially weaker. Right there you have a problem. Our skin is completely different. We have a layer of subcutaneous fat under our skin that no primate has. We've got it. Doesn't make sense. We have a hair pattern on our bodies that is substantially different. Not only is the hair reduced, but in all other primates, the thickness is on the back and it's thinner on the front. We have thickness on the front, thinness on the back. What adaptive advantage would that have? As far as our hair itself and our nails, both toenails and fingernails, our hair grows, our nails grow. They have to be physically trimmed. In all primates, their hair grows to a certain length, their nails grow to a certain length, and they stop. They don't have to bite their nails. So, again, you have a radical difference there. In our heads, you have completely different look about the faces. The prognathous face of all primates except us, the lack of a voice box, the lack of the ability to modulate speech and do speech the way we do. Not that they can't make sounds. They make very loud sounds, but they can't break those sounds into small little pieces the way we can to make language. So there's that difference, and just the difference in our faces in general. There's huge difference in our brains. Huge difference in our brains. So you've got all of that, and then on top of the clincher to the argument is this. All primates have 48 chromosomes, and we have 46. Now, how do you lose 2 whole chromosomes from where you are and produce a being that is so much more skilled and adapted, particularly intellectually, than as we are? You would think if we're going to be such a vast improvement over the primates, we would have 56 or 58 or maybe 60 chromosomes. How do you lose 2 chromosomes and get better? It really makes no sense. None of it. When you really just sit down and look at the very basics of it, none of it makes sense. We're not primates. We are not primates. To call us primates is to insult us and them, because there's just no connection. The only thing that's similar is that we share 99% the same DNA with chimps. And that sounds impressive. Wow, we're almost them. How could 1% make so much difference? Well, over 3 billion base pair genome, you're looking at, what, 30 million different base pairs. That's a lot of room. If you know what you're doing, that's a lot of room to make changes if that's what you're going to do. So there is room there. But it also overlooks the fact that humans share 50% of the genes with mice. So to say that we share 99% with chimps is impressive. To say that we share 50% with mice is even more impressive. It's all the same. All living things share a huge portion of their DNA. Because why? We're all made of the same 4 base pairs and the same 20 amino acids. Anything that lives is sharing those things. So that's the common root formula for life, not just here, but everywhere. Wherever life is, that's got to be the bottom line for all of it. So that there's going to be similarities, I think, wherever you find life. It's going to be based on those same 4 base pairs and same 20 amino acids everywhere.
So I think it's pretty clear we can't be called primates, so we're humans. How long have we been on this planet, or how long have we been human in our present form?
We've been human as we see ourselves, as you and I sitting here, or any person out anywhere. We've been like this for in the range of, I would say, 200,000 years, probably at the outside, 200,000 years. Now, I say that for a number of reasons. The primary one of which is that our mitochondrial DNA, as you do research on our mitochondrial DNA, you find that it goes back into the range of 150,000 years. So if you figure that the mitochondrial DNA says 150,000 years, the upper limit, I would think, for our species as it exists would be in the 200,000 range. But it could be that we're no older than 150,000 years. I would say the true answer lies somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 years, based on the mitochondrial DNA, which is, I think, pretty much incontrovertible.
So if we just are 150,000, 200,000 years old, the next obvious question is, how did we come about them?
Right. Well, if we're 150 to 200,000 years old, that throws a huge, gigantic wrench into the establishment position that we evolved from creatures that were walking upright approximately 4 million years ago. The early Australopithecines, Lucy, everyone is familiar with her, at around 3.2 to 3.5 million years ago, and they're finding new ones all the time. And all they say is to qualify as human is to be upright walking. If you're an upright walking pre-creature, you're called a pre-human. And even though all of those creatures, right through Neanderthal, from Lucy at 4 million years ago, right through the Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthal to Cro-Magnon, right up to Cro-Magnon, all of those creatures don't look anything like human beings as we are today. They are as different from us as primates. In fact, they look like primates. They look like upright walking primates. Up through Neanderthal, back to Lucy, and whatever's going to come before her. Everything looks like a primate. It has the thick bones, dense bones, which imply, of course, thick, strong, powerful muscles. The attachment points all bear witness to very robust muscles. They have the same facial structure as primates do, and from that whole 4 million year period down to Cro-Magnon, and the Cro-Magnons are only a couple of 100,000 years old as well. You have this incredible, strong, robust face with prognathous teeth, no chin, the structure of the shoulders and neck looking very primate-like, and seem to have the small primate brains. So what we're told are our ancestors that we're evolving from these creatures, I think is absolutely not borne out by the fossil record. The fossil record, to me, makes it clear that what are being put forth as our ancestors are in fact something else, some other kind of upright walking primate. And that human beings, because we don't appear until around 200,000 years ago, what could make something change so radically, literally overnight, in anthropological terms, and be anything remotely associated with Darwinism? It used to be that the establishment said that we descended from Neanderthals. Even though Neanderthals look so very, very different from us, it was just that somehow it had to happen, because you have Neanderthals and then you have Cro-Magnons. This is when we believe that Cro-Magnons appeared at around 35,000 years ago. Now we know, from having found overlaps between the two going back 100,000 years or more. And right now the oldest, I think, skull we have of Cro-Magnon is oldest bones we have of Cro-Magnon is 120,000 years. But you figure if they're in the fossil record at 120,000 years ago, they were there before that. So I give them 150,000, maybe 200,000 years. We just haven't found any later examples. But there's clearly a significant overlap between Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal. Neanderthal was living down to around 30,000 years ago. Cro-Magnon was living back to around maybe 150, 200,000 years. A significant overlap. So it's clear we didn't evolve from Neanderthal. Furthermore, we've now been able to sequence out some mitochondrial DNA of Neanderthal, which indicates that there's very little connection between humans and Neanderthals. Excuse me. So, with that being the case, we have to look elsewhere for the progenitor of human beings according to the Darwinian model. What is that? That's Homo erectus. It's got to be. Can't be anything else, because Neanderthal supposedly came from Homo erectus. So if you have to lift Neanderthal out of the flowchart, that only leaves humans connected to Homo erectus. And now that's what everyone is saying, that somehow we evolved from Homo erectus. The problem there is we have a very complete skeleton of a Homo erectus young man called the Lake Turkana boy. He is the most complete, in fact, fossil skeleton that we have. So we know a lot about him. And it's clear that he is extremely robust. He is extremely large. He has that same prognathous face, that primate face, and he has the small brain. There's no indication, and he's really big and powerful. Makes Arnold Schwarzenegger look like a wimp. I mean, so this is not something that can be said to be a progenitor of human beings, even though really that is what they're saying. The reality of it is it can't. So humans have to come from somewhere else, not part of the natural flow of life on Earth. Now, getting people to accept this is going to be difficult, but the facts are really clear. We simply did not evolve here. We appear here. And we appear here at around 150 to 200,000 years ago, according to our genes. So I believe, personally, that the writings of the Sumerians 4,000 years ago, as chronicled by Zecharia Sitchin in his books, The Earth Chronicles, I believe that is the most logical and reasonable explanation that there is for how we came to be. What those tablets say is that human beings were genetically engineered to be workers and slaves for a super race of beings that came to Earth from another planet in our solar system, but it doesn't matter where they came from. Somehow human beings did not develop on Earth. They were put here. Somebody had to put us here for some reason. What the Sumerians say is good enough for me right now, absent any other information, which is that we were created to be their slaves and their servants. There is clear evidence in our genes of tampering. This is not being acknowledged, but every geneticist that works on the problem is aware of it. The problems are fundamental. In the wild, when a creature is born deformed or in any way severely damaged, impaired, screwed up, whatever you want to call it, in the wild, that animal does not make it into the gene pool. The parents will abandon it. The parents will kill it and eat it if it's certain animals. But in any event, an animal that is, a creature that is severely not like it should be, is not allowed to grow to maturity and put that problem into the gene pool. This is not to say that there are not defects born among every species. There are. There are going to be sperm-egg misconnects and things are going to go wrong. It's a very complex process, the process of reproduction. It's amazing for as complex as it is that it goes as right as it does as many times as it does. But let's focus on the mistakes. There will be mistakes. But in the wild, in the natural course of things, those will not reach maturity and will not put that defect into the gene pool. Everyone acknowledges that. Most things breed true. Something like albinism, for example, being an albino, that doesn't impair you. You're white, but it doesn't keep you from living. So you've got albino alligators, albino gorillas, albino, But if it's a crippling, damaging disorder, you have disorders from mild to serious. But if it's really serious, it's not going into the gene pool. So in the wild, you don't have that. Humans are the great, great exception to that rule. The human gene pool now contains 4,000 plus genetic disorders, from mild to very serious. We have a couple dozen, like spina bifida and such as that in all things being equal, absolutely kill you before you can reach maturity. So, that being the case, what are they doing in the gene pool? How did those defects get into the gene pool? How do you have these defects occur in Africa, in China, in North America, in South America? How do you have that from the very beginning of our species? How do you have that? Absolutely impossible. Absolutely genetically impossible. What it tells us is those defects were in the very first human beings, because they can get there no other way. They can get through the gene pool no other way. How do they get there in the first place? They have to have been inserted into the gene pool initially by cutting and splicing. It can only be errors, mistakes made in the cutting and splicing process as we were being created. Now, if you make the assumption that we were indeed created to be slaves and servants, then it makes sense that the geneticists who are creating us are not going to really care. They can afford to be sloppy. Does it matter to them if 1 in 100 dies? No. Does it matter to them if 1 in 10 dies? No. It doesn't matter. These are slaves. These are less than we are substantially. Why should we worry? Why should we care? And so they leave these defects in. But they also knew, as they were leaving these defects in, that as the gene pool spread, that
Let's take a break.
One of the problems that has to be dealt with is how would the Anunnaki do this, the people that supposedly, according to the Sumerians, created human beings. What would be the process? Well, we have some speculations that we can make because there is an important issue that needs to be dealt with, and I think this is the best way that it can be dealt with. If indeed we were created genetically from other stock, but according to the Sumerians, some of the creatures of Earth were used, some of the genetics of the creatures of Earth were used to make the new slave, the new servant, better physically adapted to the planet than were the Anunnaki, the people from the other planet who created us. So let's put ourselves for a moment in the position of the Anunnaki. Their problem is this. They want to create a slave and a servant. They want to use the creature, the closest creature they can find to what they need to themselves on Earth, use that as a base. Take some of its genetics to make the skin better adapted to the amount of sunlight that this planet receives, to make themselves able to breathe the atmosphere perhaps better than they do. So there's some certain aspects they want from the creature of Earth. But they want the slave and the servant to be more like themselves than anything else. They want it to have their own size and musculature, because you wouldn't want your slave to be stronger than you are. They want it to have enough intelligence to function as a slave and a servant, be able to speak to it, to tell it what to do, and to expect that it could go off and do that job and come back and say, I'm finished with that, master, what do you want me to do now? They would have some degree of intellectual autonomy. You would want your slave to have that. So if you're going to do this and impart all these things, you're going to want to put most of your genes into the creature, the new slave and the new servant. But you're going to put some of the others. So how are you going to do that? Well, you have to find a way to make the two genomes compatible. Even if in a test tube, you've got to make a link up, you've got to make a zygote, you've got to make something that's going to then grow and produce a being, a full-fledged being like you are, or like the other creature is. We established earlier that all primates have 48 chromosomes. It's safe to assume that whatever creature of Earth they chose to use as the base model had 48 chromosomes. It's also, I think, safe to assume that the Anunnaki themselves had 46. Why? Because human beings, if we are indeed the slave and the servant, we have 46. Those 46 came from somewhere. So how did we get 46 and every other primate has 48? I think this explains it. The Anunnaki had 46. And they wanted to create a being that was going to be more like them by far than like the creature that they were mixing their genes with. So, as the Anunnaki scientists or geneticists look at it, they've got a real severe problem in that you have 48 chromosomes on the one hand and 46 chromosomes on the other hand. You've got to find a way to make that work out. You've got to either up the 46 to 48, or you've got to cut the 48 down to 46 so that you can get mitosis and get it to work. So how do you go about that? Can you cut genes off of the 48? Cut chromosomes off the 48? No, a chromosome is a lot of genes. If you cut a whole chromosome out of it, that's not the same being anymore. All right, let's say you want to put a chromosome on your 46. Can you do that? No, because again, a chromosome is a lot of genes. And if you add one or two, then you've got problems there. And remember, you've got to make a mix. How do you solve this problem? It seems insoluble on the surface. It seems absolutely insoluble. There is a way, though, and the Anunnaki seem to have found it. They took the 48, and they took two of them, and they fused them. And if you look at the human genome, you'll see that it looks very much like a primate genome, except, the second and third chromosomes are fused into one. So, what does that solve? It gives you all the chromosomal material of the primate, but it's now only taking up the space in the combining process of 46. It is 46 chromosomes with 48 chromosomes of genomic material still in there. Now, how could nature do that? How could nature fuse those two chromosomes together in any length of time? It wouldn't happen. It couldn't happen. That was done. So we have these two overwhelming pieces of genetic evidence that human beings are genetically engineered. We have the fusing of the second and third chromosomes in primates, and we have 4,000 plus genetic defects, which are vastly, vastly too many that we should have if we evolved in the natural course of events over the natural course of time on Earth.
Thank you. So you're suggesting there was, an exterior factor that used genetic manipulation or genetic engineering, and you mentioned that this is in our recorded history, ancient recorded history in the Sumerians. So who are the Sumerians? What did they have to say? How did they record this?
Okay. The people who the Sumerians say came to Earth to do the genetic engineering that we've talked about are the Anunnaki. Now, we need to do some background a little bit on who the Sumerians were first. Right now, the Sumerians are considered to be the first great culture in the history of Earth as we understand it and accept it now. They seem to have come out of the Stone Age at around 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC, at around 6,000 years ago. And they seem to have come out of the Stone Age and miraculously, virtually overnight, with no precedence whatever, created a very high civilization. In fact, they came up with over 100 of the firsts that we consider indicative of a high culture. They had the first writing, the first language, the first cities, the first roads, the first laws, the first libraries, the first schools, the first music, the first literature, right on down the line. So they had the first of everything, basically, that counts. Excuse me. So how do you come out of the Stone Age and produce this miraculously advanced culture? How do you come down out of the highlands of the Crescent Valley, the Fertile Crescent rather, and settle into this valley, the valley of modern day Iraq, the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, which is where the Sumerian culture arose, in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley of ancient times in modern day Iraq, and build this sophisticated culture with no base under you whatsoever? It absolutely defies belief. It boggles the mind. It shouldn't be. So what happens is historians, though they are very aware of it, tend to sort of leave them in the past and deal with the beginnings of history and culture with the Egyptians and the Greeks and the later Romans. That's sort of the sequence: Egyptians, Greeks, Romans. The Sumerians are very seldom talked about, very seldom dealt with, even though we have a tremendous amount of knowledge about them, because one of the things they developed first was writing, and one of the things that they stored that writing in was libraries. And their writing was done on clay tablets that were soft clay, and they used a stylus to write in what's called cuneiform, and then those would be fired in kilns, which is another invention of theirs, to turn it into stone. So they're very durable. So we have over 100,000 of these tablets have been recovered, most of which deal with the minutiae of everyday life, business deals, business transactions. Only about 5,000, as I understand it, dealing with the history of the culture and their literature and things like that. But of those 5,000 some odd tablets that we have, they tell an incredible story, the Sumerians do, of the Anunnaki, which is that there's another planet in our solar system, that gods, super beings, live on this planet, that these beings come to Earth for the specific reason of mining gold, which they need to repair their atmosphere on their planet, in the same way that we are damaging and destroying our own planet in our rise to a high civilization. Apparently the Anunnaki did the same thing on their planet. In their rise to a high civilization, they damaged their atmosphere, and they needed to replace it. Now, when our turn comes to repair our atmosphere, if we're not too late, the way we will almost certainly have to do it is to take gold, ironically enough, as finely as we can grind it up, into pieces that are just infinitely small, so that they'll float above the atmosphere, and shoot them up into space and put them up there and let them disperse, because gold is a great reflector of cosmic rays. And it's of course an insulator, but that's why you see gold sheathing on the visors of astronauts, and why gold is in the satellite in the capsules, the space capsules, to shield from cosmic rays. So that's what the Anunnaki said they had to do. Now it's amazing to me that here are the Sumerians writing 4,000 years ago saying these things that we are only just now beginning to realize ourselves we're going to have to do one day. So for whatever it's worth, they say the Sumerians say that the Anunnaki said they came to Earth to get the gold, and they did that. So they were here, they came at around 400,000 years ago, and the Anunnaki came to Earth around 400,000 years ago, they say, and they lived here for quite some time, just simply panning gold out of the rivers by, you put trays in the river and the water washes over and the gold deposits out. It's called placer mining. And placer mining is the way we mine today when we can. It's the easiest way to do it. But over time, everything taps out. So when the Tigris-Euphrates Valley tapped out, they had to move elsewhere. And so they, by then, because they were a flying civilization, they had found the mother lode in southern Africa. To this day, the mother lode of gold on Earth is South Africa. So they divided themselves up. They left half of themselves, and there were only about 600 of them at maximum, because they had to shuttle in from their planet, Nibiru. And so their 600 they divided up. Some stayed in the home base, the original home base, the Eden, and the other group moved down to the underworld, the lower world, which was southern Africa, to do the mining. And they didn't like to mine. It was hard work. It wasn't like just putting trays in water and collecting the gold out every 2-3 weeks. They had to dig it out. They didn't like doing it, so they revolted, and they said, the Anunnaki did, to their leaders, we don't want to do this anymore. So the leaders said, all right, we'll make you a slave. We'll make you a servant. And that's the reason, the impetus, according again to the Sumerian writings, for the creation of human beings. To me, this makes perfect sense. If I was a superior being from another planet and I came... If I was a superior being from another planet and I came to Earth, or anywhere, and I suddenly found myself having to do extremely difficult work, and there was another being that could be somehow genetically manipulated to turn into a slave and a servant, I would do it. And I think that they did, and I think it matches the genetic evidence that we have of what happened to us. I think the reasoning is logical. It makes sense. It may not be true. It could turn out to not be true. But why would the Sumerians leave anything even hinting at these things? Where would they get that kind of... You couldn't have that creativity at that period of time, because space travel wouldn't even be an option to them. They wouldn't even think of it. Flying, maybe not even gold mining. I mean, these are people that are just scratching for a living, supposedly, and then suddenly they're developing this culture and they're digging gold and do all it. It doesn't make sense. So I in the absence of any evidence that's compelling to the contrary, I consider the Sumerian tablets to be extremely compelling. But because it so challenges the standard accepted theories of human origins, the Darwinian theory, when scholars deal with that information, they simply ignore it. They just put it off into what they call the myth pile. They just say, that has to be myth because it can't be true. And if it can't be true, there's myth and there's truth. Not truth, got to be myth. And so it's just simply discarded information. And that's where Zecharia Sitchin came in, by going into that myth pile and looking at it and treating it as real and formulating a whole scenario that explains, I think, in much more accurate terms, for whatever degree they might be wrong, They are infinitely more accurate and factual than is the Darwinian theory of our evolution. That's absolute garbage. That is just total junk, and will be recognized as such in the not too distant future as we keep opening up our genes, and it begins to face us more and more that we're created. Then we're going to start looking for, well, who would have created us? And the answer's been sitting there all along for 4,000 years. It's just that the establishment doesn't want to look at the truth right now. But it's my job and the job of people like me to get this word out, and we're going to be standing on the right side when this is over, when the dust settles. I may not live to see it. I doubt Sitchin will live to see it, but younger people might be able to see it. But there is going to be a reckoning one day, and the truth is going to come out. And this is going to be infinitely closer to the truth, if not exactly the truth in all of its points. It's much closer to the truth than what we're taught right now, for sure.
Wow. Okay, so you said the Eden sounds kind of biblical, like a Garden of Eden. So did some of the Sumerian data go into other religions? And
well, it's important, I think, to discuss a little bit about the Anunnaki and Nibiru and the planetary orbit and stuff like that.
That's right. Where did they came from? You said they came here in a fly.
Right. What the Sumerians say about the origins of the Anunnaki is that there is another planet in our solar system, the 10th planet, or the 12th planet, if you count the Earth and the Sun and the Moon as planets as well. But for whatever you want to call it, 10th planet, planet X, 12th planet, whatever, there is supposedly, according to the Sumerians, another planet in our solar system. Now, this is pretty staggering to astronomy, but that might be true, and yet the evidence is fairly strong that it is, for a number of reasons. The Sumerians say that in the beginning, as our solar system was forming itself, there was a planet called Tiamat, which was a large planet forming. And it was forming where Bode's law says a planet should be. Now, there is a mathematical formula that says in the formation of a solar system like we have, a planet should be at a certain point, at basically a certain size, certain point, certain size, out. And Bode's law fits surprisingly well with the planets that we have now, except there's supposed to be one where the asteroid belt is, and there isn't. So what happened? Why not? And Earth is not quite, well, if you count Earth as one, it fits, but everything is a little bit off. And then you've got that missing one. What the Sumerians said is where the asteroid belt is, Tiamat was growing, and it was growing at about the right size in the right place. So the natural course of events was occurring at around 4 billion years ago. But a stray planet, they say, was sucked into our solar system. Now, stray planets are possible. We have found that out now, so this is nothing that's incredible. Stray planet came within striking range of our solar system and was captured by the gravitational pull of first the outer planets and then the sun, and it became a stable, permanent member of our solar system. But our regular planets move in counterclockwise circles, roughly. This planet was moving clockwise, and so it's moving against the grain of the flow of the other planets. And coincidentally, it's moving on the plane of the ecliptic. It could have come in north to south, or could have come in at a number of angles, but it just so happened that it came in on the plane of the ecliptic, so that those planets could affect it, so that the sun apparently could affect it and pull it in and capture it. On its second pass around, it hit Tiamat. There was a collision between Tiamat and Nibiru. Nibiru being an older planet somewhat, but still viscous, still able through the pulling of the gravity to have moons pulled out of its body. So it was still viscous. But so was Tiamat. It had more moons pulled out of its body. So we have to assume that Nibiru was perhaps maybe a 500 million years older. We're just estimating. Older, firmer, denser, but still liquidy, still flexible. So there's a collision. Nibiru basically holds together in that collision, but Tiamat does not. Tiamat is shattered into a half of itself. Half of Tiamat is blown away, explosion, poof, and it goes out in pieces. Two kinds. The outer shell, the lighter part of the surface of the cooling planet, is the granites and the water. So they go out and just go in all different directions because they're lighter. The inner viscous core, the magma, which is sticky and not hardened into stone and water, is pulled out in a long string as Nibiru swings by. The sort of the guts of Tiamat are pulled out and strung out. Also in that collision, of course, when two ball-like things hit, there's going to be some movement in a different direction, and that happened as well. So Tiamat assumes a different orbit as Nibiru assumes a different orbit as it continues on, and the remnant of Tiamat assumes a different position in the heavens. Inside now, Mars. So what's left where Tiamat was is its stretched out viscous insides, which cool and break up into, I think, the asteroid belt. And the lighter rocks and the water blow out in all directions like an explosion and form the comets. Comets come in from any direction. So I think that explains the comets. I think the Oort cloud is just an absolute fantasy. I don't believe there's an Oort cloud at all. I think that the way you explain comets... See, the problem that astronomers have with comets is this. If they're part of the natural part of the solar system, they should all be in the ecliptic. They should all be in the flat plane of the ecliptic. If they were created with the solar system, and they're obviously a part of the solar system because they're looping around the sun, they have some relation to this solar system, then they should be in the ecliptic if they were naturally formed here. But because they come in from all directions and they have different periods of orbit, they have to be explained some other way. So, rather than this collision theory. So what they say is there's a thing out there called the Oort cloud full of comets, and every once in a while one of them comes in our way. Stupid, in my view. It's easier to me to explain the comets by saying they originated here and they're coming back home. They're orbiting back home in various lengths of time because various weights, various inertia put them out on their way. And I think it's explainable in those terms. And I think that the asteroid belt is explainable in the same way. What's even more explainable to me is Earth. Now, in space, in the normal course of events, as a heavenly body forms itself, all liquids in space, all liquids in a vacuum, do the same thing. To pull themselves together, they cohese into the smallest, tightest circle that they can. All things do that. You look on the space shuttle, you see them lose some pieces of liquid, whether it's Gatorade or milk or whatever. What do? They float around, and then they pull themselves into balls, given the opportunity. That is a force of nature. It's a force of physics acting to give it its greatest density in its smallest package. Now, the one exception to that rule in the solar system that we know of is Earth. Now, why? Because Earth is missing a big chunk of its crust, its surface. What happened? Everything else is surface all the way around. There may be shallow seas possible in other planets and moons. Shallow, not deep, miles deep seas. That does not fit the pattern. What happened to Earth's missing crust? How could this happen? If you take the Tiamat story, the collision with Nibiru and Tiamat, and you've got Tiamat sitting there, and half of it is sheared off, the remaining half is still viscous liquid. It's still cooling. So but now the outside of it here is kind of crusty. It's had a half a billion years, let's say, to cool off. So you've got some crust forming and maybe some water. That's going to crack. And in fact, the tablets say the outside was cracked like an egg. So it's cracked. What's this? This is raw open wound now. This is viscous magma. This is maybe down to the core. What's going to happen? It's got to form in on itself. It's got to turn into another ball, but a much smaller ball than the original Tiamat. And it's going to be left with a gaping wound here. And because the crust is cracked from the collision, that is going to be able to move back here. And so it will slowly form itself into a new, smaller planet, leaving a gaping piece of itself missing and breaking its crust into big chunks, or as we call them today, plates, plate tectonics. Earth is the only planet with plate tectonics. It's the only planet with room to move, with room for the earth, for the land, for the surface land to move. And so it does. So it's shifting around because it's missing so much of its crust. To me, this makes sense to explain Earth's absolute uniqueness, that early collision theory. So you explain the comets, you explain the asteroid belt, you explain you explain plate tectonics, you explain the missing crust, and you explain something else, which is Pluto. Now, in our solar system, Pluto is a great mystery, a great anomaly, because, as I said earlier, everything that forms naturally should form on the ecliptic. You're pathetic. Okay, Pluto. Okay, let's start with Pluto. So Pluto, it explains Pluto as well, because Pluto is a great mystery. Anything that forms as part of the solar system should be on the ecliptic. Pluto is 17 degrees off the ecliptic, above the ecliptic. And Pluto does not orbit in a circle the way everything else does. Pluto's orbit carries it inside, at times, the planet of Neptune. Inside the planet of Neptune. So, given that, it's clear that Pluto did not form as a planet. Anything naturally formed as a part of the solar system should be within the plane of the ecliptic, the flat plane of the ecliptic. Pluto is not. Pluto orbits 17 degrees off the ecliptic, and for some of the time its orbit passes inside the orbit of Neptune. This is highly unusual, highly anomalous, and has never made sense. What most people have assumed is that Pluto didn't form as one of the regular planets. It was somehow or other put in its place where it is. How that could happen, possibly by a collision, possibly by another capture event, no one has ever really understood. What the Sumerian tale says or indicates is that as Nibiru was passing out of the solar system, it happened to pass close enough to Saturn to be able to pull a moon of Saturn away from Saturn and drag it with it for a while and then drop it off where it is now as Pluto. So given the fact that there was, in the collision, Nibiru was knocked off of the ecliptical orbit that it was on to begin with before the collision, and whatever degree it's knocked off, Pluto was left, and it ended up at 17 degrees off the ecliptic with an orbit that is so erratic that it carries it well out beyond the orbit of Neptune and well inside the orbit of Neptune. So those are part of the explanations of anomalies in the solar system that are explained by the Nibiru-Tiamat collision as described by the Sumerians, but which is totally rejected by the establishment. And I think that as with the genetic engineering part, over time it's going to prove out that that probably has much more truth to it than does the things that we're told now, that Pluto somehow formed itself out there, or maybe perhaps came in from the Kuiper belt or something else.
Okay. So if Planet X does exist and it seems to fit in to what's going on, where would it be now?
Well, if Planet X exists, and I believe that it does, and if you make the assumption that it caused certain events or had certain effects on planet Earth, and while it was in the neighborhood of the solar system, I follow Sitchin's chronology pretty closely. I believe that it was here during the time of the Great Flood. I think it might have contributed, in fact, to the Great Flood, which I think occurred at the end of the last ice age, which was around 11,000 BC, which is 13,000 years ago approximately. I think that if you go with 11,000 BC as a rough estimate of where the flood occurred and where to start, and you divide by 3,600 year increments. And it's important to note, by the way, that the planet Nibiru, once it settled in after the collision and it settled into its orbit, this is something that I didn't mention, it settled into a 3,600 year orbit, a long ellipse, not circular, not counterclockwise, but a clockwise ellipse, like the orbit of a comet. And so if you divide that orbit of 3,600 years with a start date, a fixed point in time of the end of the last ice age, which I think would have caused the Great Flood. Now, if that dating is wrong, then there are some problems, and you can fudge the date of the end of the last ice age as much as 1,000 years plus or minus, approximately 11,000 BC, 13,000 from now. But if you use that, then you divide by increments of 3,600. And as Sitchin points out, at each division point, at say 7,400 BC, you have the moving from the Stone Age to the, Iron Age. And these are not coming to mind right now, but then 3,600 years later, I think it's like 3,600 or 3,400 BC, 3,200. There's another big boost to human technology. I can't remember what that. Maybe the Copper Age or maybe the Bronze Age. But Sitchin seems to feel like Earth gets a boost in technology, a boost in knowledge every time Nibiru comes around. I don't know why that would necessarily be a function of it, because if the Anunnaki are here all the time, they could, give that boost at any point that they wanted to. So I'm not as sure of that. I base my theory, my belief in it, around the end of the last ice age and the Great Flood. If you divide by 3,600, working your way down, you get the last time Nibiru was here was around 200 BC. But if you waffle that a couple of hundred years to around zero, because it's not necessarily exactly like clockwork 3,600 years, that could be just an approximation. So if you bring it to around zero, the year zero, then I think you could explain the Star of Bethlehem, which is a reasonably well documented in that it was a star. Now, what was it? There are various theories about it being conjunctions of planets in the sky, but if you make the assumption that something was there for sure to be written about in the way that it was, I would think that Nibiru would be a good candidate for being the Star of Bethlehem, the unexplained, unexpected star in the sky. If it was, then that means it's 3,600 years until it comes around again. If you say the year zero is the start point, then that means we're 2,000 years into the orbit. That means it's just made its far turn out, its aphelion turn, and it's just beginning to come back. And we've got another, say, 1,600 years to go, and that would put it back here around 3,600. If we use 200 BC as the start point, then it would be 3,400 AD. In any event, it's certainly, in my opinion, not going to be back here anytime soon. Now, I know there's some talk now and discussion about the possibility that it may come in sooner. In 2003 is one theory that's being proposed, 2005, 2007, and of course the classic Maya 2012, the one that the Maya said is the end of one era and the beginning of a next. So I don't think it's any of those, and I don't think it could be even the 2012. I think because Nibiru is supposed to be a large planet, 3 to 4 times larger than Earth, number one. Number two, it's supposed to be very bright in the sky, very bright. We would have to consider that to be caused by having a bright albedo, which is the amount of reflective power that it has, and I think that would come from it having a lot of water on its surface. And it's said to be a watery planet, and the Anunnaki were masters of water. If there's one fingerprint that you see of the Anunnaki wherever they lived, they absolutely turned desert made deserts bloom. They were geniuses with water and the movement of water and the conservation of water and the use of water. So let's assume that they're a water planet. If that's the case, if it is large, 3 or 4 times larger than Earth, and it does have a very bright albedo and shines very clearly, then it's going to be visible way, way out, way out. And we have in the United States, but around the world, literally thousands of very serious, hardcore amateur astronomers who are amateur in name only because they take it very seriously. They have very good equipment, and they're in a race constantly to be the next person to find an incoming comet or an incoming asteroid, but particularly an oncoming comet. So they're looking out in the area where a planet or anything coming into our solar system would be visible. And in doing that, anything that was large and bright would be noticeable way, way, way out. And if anything was coming our way, it wouldn't be hard to put infrared on it and see if it was indeed coming our way, or if it was just sitting there. And this is one of the things that they do to try to pick out whatever's coming our way as they look for the redshifts. So there's a lot of intense effort going on around the world looking at 360 degrees of sky for that next big comet coming our way. If Nibiru was within reach of here with even a few years, it would, traveling at planetary speeds, at even the fastest of planetary speeds. Earth travels at like 65,000 miles an hour. You can do the math. You can figure it out. You can figure how many astronomical units out one might reasonably expect an object of that magnitude to be seen and of that albedo to be seen, and you can draw kind of an estimated X of where it should show up to your standard, average, good, high-powered amateur telescope. And then you divide that by different planetary speeds, and you can go, you wouldn't necessarily go with a comet speed or an asteroid speed because they're much smaller bodies. If this is a big body, you have to assume it's traveling at more planetary speeds. And you divide it out. And I think that what you would see is it would take literally years for something to move from that great distance where it would first be visible into the solar system proper. So I don't think it's possible that Nibiru is coming anytime soon. Nibiru probably caused or had some effect on the Great Flood because it was in the neighborhood clearly because they had a meeting about what to do with the humans. When they knew the flood was coming, they had a debate about whether to let us live or let us die. And the vote was to let us die, in the same way that there was a close vote whether or not to make us in the first place. And the vote then was to make us, And when it came time to vote again, the vote was to let us die, to destroy us in the flood. Let us be destroyed by the flood. The Anunnaki didn't make the flood, but they had to deal with it. When they knew it was coming, it was something that they did not have the power to stop. So as they anticipated it, they said, what do we do with the humans? They voted to let us die, and that was that. So it means that Nibiru was in the neighborhood. Of course, we were saved by Enki allowing Utnapishtim to build a boat and save a few. That's another story. But if Nibiru was in the neighborhood at the time of the flood, which we make the assumption it was, and Sitchin is the one who put that out, and Sitchin is the one who made the 3,600-year divisions as to where historical changes occurred in the lives, in the history of humanity. Significant changes occurred at every 3,600-year mark. So those numbers that I gave earlier are pretty much his numbers. So I've always known him to say that. It's not Nibiru coming back, but it is a significant event of some kind or other. Of all the things I've read and that I know about, this is the only thing that really concerns me, that really causes me pause, gives me pause to worry. I think that the 2012 would not have been given such emphasis if there wasn't a real problem with it. What also troubles me about 2012 is this. If the Anunnaki knew or could see into the future and had some way of doing that, or in some way or other could calculate an event, a cyclical event we've had a lot of extinctions here on Earth, major colossal catastrophic extinction events. And let's say that the Anunnaki could predict that, but couldn't stop it for some reason. Let's just say a giant asteroid. Now we kid ourselves by saying, well, okay, if we knew a giant asteroid was coming and was going to hit us, we could just send nuclear weapons up and knock it out of its path just enough for it to miss Earth. It makes you wonder if that's the case, then maybe what I'm going to say is wrong. But if it's possible to do that, but maybe it's not. Let's just say that the Anunnaki knew for a fact and told the Maya, because they obviously gave the Maya all their knowledge about how to do the calendar. And they told the Maya, it all ends at 2012. It's all going to be over. Something's bad, colossally bad is going to happen, and that's going to be the end of it, 2012. Mark it down. And they themselves, you have to also wonder, why did they leave? Well, okay, they had a nuclear war among themselves. They decimated themselves, but they recovered. They were here for 2,000 years after that war. And they recovered, and they were going back strong. So why would they just pack up and leave? What would force them to do that? They're gods. I mean, they're not living here that bad. They're living large here. So why would they go back home? Well, the only answer I can see is that they knew something bad was going to happen within the next cycle. Within the next cycle. And if you make the assumption that the last time was around 0 year or 0 to 200 or whatever, if they don't get on board Nibiru that time, that pass, then by the next time it comes around, the devastating event is going to have happened. So that might explain why they packed up and left when they did. Because they've been here for 400,000 years, and then suddenly, boom, they're all going to leave. That's really bothered me and never made sense. So if you blend those two things together, the fact that there's this warning of catastrophe of a major scale in 2012, and the Anunnaki leave at around 2000, then possibly there is something really, really bad that's going to happen. Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe it is possible to deflect something like that. Maybe they could have done it, and maybe I'm reading why they left completely wrong. I'm just telling you that of all the things I know, that's the only one that really does bother me to any extent.
Okay. So, as far as the information in your book, it's very powerful. And do you think that this is something that we're rediscovering now and relearning about, or do you think that there's an element of society that knows this and is suppressing it? That kind of a conspiracy theory type of question. Like, do you think this is being withheld from us for certain reasons, or do you think we just innocently forgot or got lost or somehow now we're relearning?
That is a very interesting question as to whether or not this information that I am aware of is being suppressed or has just been forgotten over the course of time. I think there's a combination of both at work there. I think most of it was lost in the Great Fire at Alexandria. I think had that material survived to the modern times intact, I think we would know, if not all, at least a lot of these things are the truth. But since we lost all that information, I think that it was forgotten. A lot of it was forgotten. And now I think more than suppression, keeping it from general dissemination, is hubris. And I think it's the hubris of the, quote, experts who are supposed to be on top of these things, but who really don't look beyond their own narrow fields. But if you get thousands of individuals clinging to their tree, you know, every PhD is a PhD with his arms wrapped around his tree in the great scheme of knowledge. And they're so busy learning and holding on to the knowledge of their tree, they really look only maybe one or two or three trees beyond themselves to learn anything. You know, an anthropologist might learn a little bit from a geologist, but in general, you see what I mean? They don't have the time, the inclination, and the encouragement to look beyond their specialty area, to try to get a glimpse of the forest, of how it all ties together. So I think that their knowledge of their tree leads them to believe that everything that they hear about everybody else's tree is true. But it's being funneled through a need to conform to what the general consensus of opinion is about how things happen, which is that Darwinism is correct, there is no 10th planet, there is no life outside the earth, and all of these things that we're talking about in a very matter-of-fact way as being real is totally rejected by the establishment paradigm. So it's the hubris of individuals, men and women, who have been told by others and who constantly are reinforcing to themselves that they're experts and that they know best and that they know everything there is to know about what they're supposed to know about, when in fact the whole history of science is correcting mistakes. That's all science is a forward progression of correcting mistakes. They're constantly wrong, and yet at any moment in time that you pick them out and you say to the experts who are alive at that moment, what do you know about everything? They'll say, we know this and this and this and this and this is absolutely true. And 10 years, 5 years, 15 years from now, everything they're saying is going to be disproved, or most of it is going to be disproved. I mean, Newtonian physics ran for 200 years, and then Einstein came along and upset that. But somebody's going to upset Einstein. We're going to learn to, go into different dimensions and perhaps even time travel. I mean, we're so abysmally ignorant, and we refuse to acknowledge it because our expert's job is to be an expert. And so I think more than a conspiracy of somebody sitting around saying this knowledge has to be squashed is just very, very ignorant, afraid, small inside people who think otherwise about themselves, of course, but who are afraid to stretch, afraid to look out and beyond, and because they've got to protect themselves. And I want to be the first to raise my hand and say that if I was one of them, if I had a wife, if I had children, if I had a mortgage, if I lived a normal life, I would have to protect it with every bit of the zeal that they do. The only reason I can do what I do and say the things that I say is that I have sacrificed a normal life. And it's not just me. It's most of the people in this field that you will talk to. They do not, for the most part, lead normal lives. Or if they do, their lives have been twisted way out of a normal shape in order to do this kind of work. It's very demanding in time and energy and effort. It's not very rewarding in terms of money. And so it takes a very special and very small group of people who do it. But in the end, we're right and they're wrong, and that's going to come to pass. I just hope it's in my lifetime. They had a problem. So Stephen Gould and some others came up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium. And what punctuated equilibrium says is that as life develops, there are catastrophes that wipe them out. It's pretty clear from the fossil record that these happen. There's been 5 major ones and several minor ones. In the major ones, you had wipeouts of life forms anywhere from 50% to 80%, 90% of all life forms wiped out. The first big one, the Permian, wiped out about 90% of the life forms that existed at that time. And yet, after this happens, the ecological niches are filled with new species that are suited to the new environment, whatever it is. So you have the catastrophe that changes everything, changes the atmosphere and changes the earth. Some things survive because they are adapted or are able to adapt themselves to the new environment. But then new species come in that are adapted to whatever that new environment is each time. Now, how does that happen? How can that happen? How can they rapidly fill in within a few thousand years all of the niches? Can evolution do that? No. There's no record. You would have to see it. The example that I give when I talk is this, that you take a kernel of popcorn. Now, under normal circumstances, under the Darwinian scheme of things, if you were to heat that popcorn kernel, it would puff itself into one piece of popcorn. And that's the Darwinian theory of one thing moving into the next stage up its ladder as it goes. But during punctuated equilibrium, what they're postulating is that the one kernel of popcorn is somehow going to pop itself into a whole big bucket that you get at the movie. That really is not possible, and yet that's what they're saying. They're saying that the few survivors somehow explode biologically and genetically into all these different species that fill the ecological niches. That really, it can't happen under the Darwinian scenario. So what you have the punctuated equilibrium people saying is that Darwinism works when it can work, but when it can't work, something else works, which is so how do you turn a force of nature on and off like a switch? Can't really happen. What I think and what I say is probably Earth is being terraformed. Earth is being watched over. And when they see that a catastrophe has happened, they wait, they give it time to settle out, they give the new environment time to establish itself. They come in, they take some tests, and they say, okay, these things can live here now. And these things are dumped off here to live and make their way until the next catastrophe. That explains the facts to me, for as silly as it sounds. You know, terraformers, cosmic dump trucks is another term that I use. For as silly as that sounds, it seems to match the facts of what the fossil record tells us better than Darwinism by a long shot. But obviously, because it's so far from Darwinism and the establishment is so heavily bought into Darwinism, it isn't going to be readily accepted. But I think over time, something like that is going to be the real true answer of what's going on here.
Thank you. So, as far as humans are concerned, you went over micro and macroevolution. We're told that we evolved from primates.
Right.
So, how does that play in? I mean, what does that bear out? I mean,
we are told, as far as human beings go, we are told that we evolved in the Darwinian sense from primates. That we are related genetically and biologically and very closely to chimpanzees and somewhat more distantly to gorillas, at the micro level, which is changes in parts. Darwin himself found the changes in the beaks of the finches, Darwin's finches. the shells of the tortoises that he found on the Galapagos. So he found indications of change at the micro level, at the part level. And what he postulated, what he extrapolated is, well, if we can see obvious change at the micro level, then we can legitimately assume that change also is going to occur at the macro level, at the whole body level, so that it will be possible for one species to change into, over time, another species entirely. And that was the bedrock of his theory. And again, he said, but if you can't find any transitional species where it's clear that one thing is turning into something else, or that thing is turning into something else yet again, there will be a problem. And that's been the result of much more detailed analysis of the fossil record. There are no intermediate species. Now, once scientists began to understand that and realize that what you saw was long periods of life existing in what is called stasis, which means the same. It basically stays the same. In the fossil record, you have these long periods of stasis followed by these periods of catastrophe where everything is just gone. It's wiped out. Not everything, but most everything. And then you have these periods of not much happening, and then suddenly the niches get filled up again very rapidly, these explosions of life forms. So when science in the 50s and 60s began to see what the reality of the situation was and how far it was from classic Darwinism, which they were already very heavily bought into because that's what they used to maintain the moral high ground against the creationists. They knew so chemically complex. There's no doubt that it couldn't possibly have developed here. It had to have been delivered here, and it had to be delivered whole and intact, and it had to come at about 4 billion years ago. So given those facts right out of the box, there is no Darwinian development at the first stage of life as we understand it. Then as you move along through the history, Darwin postulated that from that beginning, however that beginning occurred, and he was no more clear on it than we were until just recently, however that beginning occurred, it had to develop very slowly but very regularly toward more and more complex beings, more creatures, however you care to term that. And as that slow, gradual progression developed, ever more sophistication was put into the system by what he called natural selection, which is little traits that would somehow help a creature improve its odds of reproducing itself, would make for more and more and more sophisticated beings and creatures. And that's how we supposedly evolved, a word Darwin didn't use but which became popular later. We evolved from those bacteria through millions and millions and millions of slight improvements to creatures that were intermediate, the intermediate forms. Now when Darwin put forth his theory in 1869, he said very clearly, if the intermediate forms that I'm postulating cannot be found, then my theory is wrong. He knew that there was a problem because even in his day it was clear in the fossil record that there were these huge gaps and then things would just suddenly appear. So he said, now that we know to look for them, we should find these intermediate species. We haven't found any really to this point. We do find development within species. We do find changes at the macro. We're taught today by the Darwinians or those who espouse the Darwinian theory that life evolved from an initial pool of water with molecules in it that were basically inorganic, and that some way, sometime, somehow, those inorganic molecules were swept together into a living entity, something that was somehow alive. Now, we know that's not true now, and it's beginning to shift. The teaching is still the same because it takes a while to change the books, but it's becoming acknowledged that life almost had to be delivered to Earth. And the facts are incontrovertible that that's going to be the truth. When life first appears at around 4 billion years ago, the solar system itself is only about a half a billion years old, only about 500 million years old. Not really enough time for anything to develop because the Earth was still basically a seething ball of magma then. Very little land had actually cooled out, very little water would be available for anything to form in. The Darwin's warm pool, warm pond, couldn't possibly have existed when life first came. Not only did life come suddenly at a time when it's just inexplicable that that would happen, it came in not one form but in two forms. Prokaryotic bacteria, there are two kinds. For a long time it was thought that there was just one kind, but there are actually two. So you have suddenly, at around 4 billion years ago, two distinct separate kinds of prokaryotic bacteria appear on Earth as the first life forms. And those life forms were so complex and so complicated, even though they didn't have the nucleus of the eukaryotic bacteria, which came later, much later. Even though they didn't have cell nucleus, they're functioning to this day, because we have them to this day. Their functioning is so complex